I'm John Law, this is Chasing Cars, and in today's video we're comparing two 7-seat SUVs in, as what Ponch has coined, base model realness guys. On my right shoulder we've got the Toyota Kluger V6, the brand new vehicle, and we've also got on my left shoulder the Kia Sorento. And in today's video we're going to evaluate both of these 7-seaters and see which one is going to be best for your large family. So, in today's video, what have we got? Well, let's start with the Kia because it's been on sale slightly longer here in Australia, been a little over a year now. And this car we've got is the base model S guys, the absolute stripper of the range. And you can get this car on the road here for $49,290 drive away, which is pretty competitive. It's got a V6 engine under the bonnet, but you can spend an extra $3,000 to get yourself a nicer diesel engine, which we'll come back to when we take these cars out for a drive. And on my right shoulder, we've got the brand new competitor for this car, the Toyota Kluger. It's a longer running nameplate in Australia. This is the 4th generation car, and you might know it as the Toyota Highlander in your country, because actually it's only called the Kluger in Australia and Japan. So a little bit of a rarity there, nerd fact. Anyway, this is all new. It sits on the TNGA K chassis, so it's a lot better to drive than the old car. But the question is this base model GX with a V6 that costs $52,863 drive away here in Australia better to drive and better to live with than the Kia Sorento? And that's what we're going to find out in today's video. And if you have any opinions on these two, please let me know down in the comment section which one you'd pick, or perhaps which one you have picked. And while you're down there, we'd also love it if you could hit subscribe and the bell icon. Let's talk about the design of these two vehicles, because although it's subjective, it is one of the biggest reasons that people buy cars, at least in my book, but you can let me know down in the comment section below if it matters to you. So the Kluger, while it looks a lot better than the generation it replaces, it still doesn't have much of a signature to it. It definitely looks like a Kluger, this latest generation, but looking like a Kluger may or may not be a great thing, certainly not the best thing in my opinion. Anyway, there are some interesting design touches to talk about. The rear lights are a nice touch and they do bring it into the 21st century compared to the last car. And then we've got down the flanks this sort of Supra-esque kind of rear haunch going on, which, you know, gives a little bit of visual interest. But ultimately, I think the Kluger is non-offensive and less offensive than the old car, but it's not something that you're going to be riding home about, and it's not something you're going to turn up at the local car park and people are going to think, wow, that looks awesome. On the other hand, I reckon the Kia Sorento might be. You've got the Kia signature tiger nose front grille, which looks really cool. It's got a deep chin, really nice aggressive front end on it, even on this base model car. And that's something that's going to crop up quite a lot in this video, is that both of these cars, but really the Sorento, doesn't feel that much like a base model. It's got great detailing, the sides are a little bit flatter and it's a little bit more square and bulky, but the rear lights, their Art Deco little signature, I think the Sorento looks really cool, so it's a win for the Sorento when it comes to the looks department. But now we're going to jump inside the cabin of the Kluger and see if the new car is any better than the old car and how practical it is compared to the Sorento. Alright, jumping straight into the Toyota Kluger GX, and much like the Sorento, you get this really well appointed and well kitted out cabin. You get everything you need to drive in, and that's just a really great thing for buyers, that the base model doesn't really miss out on any of the essentials. That's great. So 8-inch touchscreen, which isn't the biggest and isn't the prettiest, and Toyota's software isn't great, but you do have really nice wired Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. You also get DAB radio, which is hooked up to a surprisingly good 6-speaker stereo. Below that, we've got your aircon controls. It's just standard aircon. The hybrid actually gets tri-zone climate control. This is just basic manual AC, which works pretty well. Nice big chunky buttons ahead of you. Speaking of chunkiness, you've got big font in the analog dials. You've also got a 4.2-inch TFT screen, which gives you all your driving readouts and that sort of stuff. And the layout in here is pretty straightforward. You've got all nicely arranged buttons on the steering wheel for cruise control and safety systems on the right, and then controlling the TFT screen on the left. And then below that, you've got all the buttons you need, drive mode and sort of stuff down here just near the gear stick. So it all feels quite well laid out, and it also feels quite well appointed in the high traffic touch points. Steering wheel, nice creamy leather, no plastic base model wheel here, thank goodness for that. The gear stick as well is appointed in leather. You've got this nice soft padding on the dashboard here, up on the dash top, although in front of me here is a little bit scratchy, but whatever, it is the base model. Soft touch door cards, a little bit of an armrest here, which isn't the most comfortable. The center armrest as well kind of sucks because you've got these firm bits where it joins to this weird roller door that sort of impedes access. I would just prefer it if it was just one whole thing that folded up. That would just be easier and better. But other practicalities are pretty cool. You've got these trays here underneath the touchscreen. You've got a nice spot where it looks like there's supposed to be wireless charging, but obviously there isn't in the base model, and that's quite plasticky. And then you've also got a tray up there, so plenty of places to store stuff. 2 cup holders in the center, which are good for 700ml-ish size bottle. My bottle here fits really well in there. It also fits well in the door bins, but the door bins aren't as big as in some competitors. You're not going to be able to squeeze a 1.5 litre bottle in there. So that's one little detractor for this car. But one nicety I'll point out quickly is that with these 3 USB ports, you've got this little pop-up scenario so you can run your cable from the USB port up into that tray really cleverly, and that's a really nice little design touch for the Kluger, which is otherwise a very functional front cockpit. So let's jump in the back seats and see what the space is like. So into the back seat of the Kluger, and the same cloth material that features on the front seats, which are incidentally very comfy, comes back to play back here. Sort of got some orange texturing in it. Doesn't feel that great, but it is slightly nicer than the Sorentos. And on that note, the back seat is a little bit better equipped than the Sorentos in most respects. For example, we have a climate zone back here. Well, not a climate zone, but you can choose your temperature, hot, cold, fan speed, and where it's coming out of these vents and ones at your feet. You've also got 2 USB fast chargers back here, which is nice. 2 pockets behind the seats, and a flip down armrest with 2 cup holders. Speaking of which, that brings me on to the door cards, which are very cheap feeling. They've got this horrible scratchy plastic all the way across the top. All of this scratchy plastic here, which marks up really easily. It's going to get scratched up and look kind of worn out quite quickly. So yeah, that's where this car gives away its base car origins. Just in that sort of choice to not use slightly nicer materials, which I think could have elevated the rear seat just a little bit more. But one thing that's not in question is the amount of space on offer back here. I've got good knee room behind my own driving position, and incidentally, this bench isn't actually slid the whole way back. I can grab that and go all the way back, so I've got even more room. But if I have the bench here, I'm still comfortable, and that gives a bunch more space in the back seat for passengers and cargo as well. Tow room is very generous, obviously. It's an SUV, and headroom isn't incredible, but it's certainly not bad at all. I'm 6'2", so pretty tall for a back seat, and yeah, mostly it's very good. The middle seat though is a real oddity. It's not very good. It's very flat, it's very hard, and it puts you on a bit of a perch compared to the out-of-board seats. So really this car feels a little bit more like a 6-seater. The other thing I'm going to bring up is that it hasn't sort of been reconfigured to suit the right-hand drive market. The Sorento has the 2 sliding seats on the left, meaning it's easier to access the back seats in my book, whereas the Kluger hasn't had that treatment done to it. So you've got the single sliding seat at the back here, so you have to have a little bit more effort to climb into the 3rd row, which is where we're going to go now. So here in the 3rd row, I've entered after a slightly awkward clamber in between the seats. I'm obviously pretty tall. This isn't going to be the usual place for a 6'2" adult, but you know what? It's not too bad back here. I've got a decent amount of headroom. The dropping headline does start to encroach just a little bit if I sit up totally straight. My knees are touching this seat, but if you're shorter than me, you're actually going to be fairly comfortable because there's actually plenty of toe room and a good width to this bench. It is slightly inclined backwards as well. You can adjust that with these little handles, so you can be fairly comfortable. Got a good view out as well, and you've got space for 4 bottles with 4 bottle holders, 2 on each side, which seems pretty absurd given the use case of these back seats, but hey, better to have more bottle holders than less, I reckon. Anyway, let's jump out of this Toyota Kluger and into the Sorento and see how that car compares to this one. Following up behind the Toyota Kluger, jumping into the Kia Sorento, and it's a real surprise to know that this is the more affordable of the 2 cars, because when it comes to cabin presentation, the Kia really does have the Kluger licked. In terms of coffee, if I was going to use a coffee analogy, the Kluger is a Macca's coffee. This is a coffee from your favorite. espresso shop, straight out of an espresso machine, really delicious and ready to go. It just feels that little bit more special, a little bit more care's been taken putting it together in the design phase, and that really pays off, at least in my book. So starting with technology, we've got the slightly smaller screen here in the base model Sorento, so the 8-inch rather than the 10.25-inch that the up-spec models get. And then in front of me, I got a pair of analog dials, which look nice, and they've got a 4.2-inch TFT screen in between them, but it is in landscape orientation, which actually works really well. You can see a little bit more driving info, driving modes, and that sort of stuff. It just works a little bit better, looks a little bit different. Speaking of which, we've got the aircon controls, also again, basic manual AC, but they've got these slightly knurled dials which set off the rest of these sort of almost Art Deco highlights, this silver stuff, without being chrome, so it's not going to blind you, and these really cool fish scale details here in front of the passenger. It's just nice, it comes together really well, set off by this leather appointed steering wheel. Yes, there's a fair bit of piano black on it, but not a big deal for me. Got a leather shifter as well, and like I mentioned in the Kluger, this thing has just a slightly better feeling of being put together with a little bit more solidity. There's no sort of movement in any of the stuff you touch. Door cards are a little bit nicer, armrest is plusher. On the whole, it just feels better appointed, but it does lose points for having one of these, which is a key. The Kluger gets keyless entry right from the base model up to the high spec models. Yeah, it's a bit of a shame when you get into a car and you have to get a key out of your pocket, but I guess that's first world problems. Practicality wise, it's very much on par with the Kluger, though you don't have the secondary shelf here. Just got a nice soft bit of plastic there. You do have a covered space for your phone, which is rubberized and ready for a wireless charging pad higher up the range. Under the really nicely soft padded armrest, you've got a deep bin, which is much easier to access than the Kluger's awkward system, and yeah, just feels good. You've got this nice little pocket here for odds and ends as well. You pop your phone or something like that in there. Door bins are decent. Again, not the biggest in class, on par with the Kluger. So yeah, I just think Kia has done a better job making the Sorento feel even less like a base model than Toyota has done with the Kluger. Anyway, let's jump in the back seat and see how comfortable it is in the rear. So the back seat of the Sorento continues the theme of the front seat in looking that little bit more presentable than in the Kluger. The cloth here looks a little bit less like a base Camry cloth, and it just is a higher quality piece of equipment, although you don't have the separate controls for your aircon back here. You do have these nicely designed vents, and below that you've got a 12-volt socket and a single USB port, which actually gives you more options than in the Kluger, because you get a 12-volt insertion with 2 USB chargers, but you know, much of a muchness, whatever. Let's get on to the other practicalities, including this nice sturdy center armrest with 2.5 cup holders here. And then you also get a really nice little cup holder here that you can put a little coffee cup in if you're sitting in the back seat, which I think is a really clever little touch. And then the door bins are pretty good, but again, only really big enough for a 700 milliliter bottle. Up on the door cards though, we have soft touch material, which is great. And we also get these fish scale motifs popping up back here. And then comes to space, it's pretty good. This is slightly compromised, just like it was in the Kluger, for rear seat room. So if I slide myself back on the rails, you can see I've got not quite as much space as I would as a maximum in the Kluger. However, I've still got plenty of space there left over for me, and that keeps the rear pretty nice and comfortable. Tow room as well is very good, very generous, and headroom is actually slightly better than in the Kluger, given this car's slightly boxier roofline. So we're done with the second row. Let's check out the third row before we get to the boot. Jumping into the third row of the Sorento is still not a particularly dignified experience, even with the 2 seats folding forward. It's still quite a narrow aperture, and the way the door actually encroaches at the top of where it joins the body makes the aperture quite awkward to get into. But once you're here, it's not too bad. I have slightly less space than in the Toyota Kluger, owing to its slightly shorter dimensions. This is sort of a half size smaller than that car. But my knees, again, are touching the seat. But I do have decent toe room, and if I sit up sort of straight-ish, I've got good headroom above the front of my head. But as you can see, if I lean back, I can't actually reach the headrests because of the way it slopes back down. But again, I'm 6'2", so the likelihood of me being back here is pretty low. The other cool stuff we have is obviously the electrically folding rear seat. So you just press the button and it slides out of the way. Really nice touch on the base car. You also get a single cup holder and a space for, I don't know, a packet of McDonald's sliced apples or something if you're keeping your kids healthy, or maybe a cheeseburger if you're not. Yeah, nicely appointed, pretty decent for short trips. And yeah, that's the Kia Sorento's practicality. Let's check out the boots of these two cars now before we take them out for a spin. So around to the rear of these two large SUVs, and as a point of interest, neither of them announce themselves as the base model. So for you buyers, you're not going to be ridiculed for buying the cheapest one available like you might have been in the past. No GX badge, no S badge. Anyway, let's pop the boot and find out one of the reasons you might opt for these larger SUVs rather than their similarly priced mid to upper spec medium-sized SUV counterparts, RAV4 in this case, Sportage in the Kia's case, and that is that they have a bit of extra boot space. And as you can see, the Chasing Cars suitcases fit in here absolutely no trouble when you've got the 5 seats set up. You're not going to get 3 in there when 7 seats are up, of course, but to be honest, the 241 litre quoted space with 7 seats up isn't bad, and it's pretty comparable to something like a Toyota Corolla hybrid hatch. So yeah, the Kluger is actually quite a practical vehicle. It is longer than the Sorento, notably longer than the Sorento, so that's how it deals with its 7 seats of comfort and extra luggage space a little bit better. So yeah, pretty decent. And then in this configuration, 5 seats, you've got 552 litres of space. Not too bad at all. And then the boot itself is pretty well finished. Nice boot floor, not a bad load lip to get over, pretty easy to load. You do have these crappy curry hooks here, which don't really do anything for me. I just think they look cheap. They could have been done much better. Under the boot floor, you do have the tools to change the spare tyre, which sits underneath the car, which is a nice little extra peace of mind when you're going touring in the country. Now let's close the boot of this guy, which is one of the more awkward things to do on this car. It requires quite a lot of strength to close it properly. But anyway, let's leave the Kluger behind and take a little look at the Sorento's boot. Before we get under the tailgate, just want to point out the design again back here. I know it's not to everyone's taste, you can let me know down below, but the lozenge taillights, spaced out lettering at the back, looks really nice. Manual tailgate, again, you've got to spend a little bit more to get electric. And in terms of boot space, it's pretty comparable to the Kluger. So with 7 seats up, it's only got 187 litres, so actually that's not so comparable to the Kluger. I mean, it's going to be much harder to fit in school kids' bags when you've got all 7 seats loaded up. But with the seats folded, according to Kia, there's actually almost 100 litres more space, actually 110 litres more space, because it's 662 litres in this configuration. Now to me, it looks very comparable. I don't know if that literage is on par for each other. They're both VDA numbers quoted by the manufacturers in Australia, but yeah, you know, both very practical, basically, is what I'm saying. Now, the Sorento is a slightly nicer finished boot. It's also got a spare tyre under the rear of the car, and you've got your tools to change it and your cargo cover under the floor of the car. But you've got extra niceties back here, including electrically folding rear seats. You just tap the buttons and they fold right away, or you can tap the button and they fold and slide out of the way for easier access to the rear row. And for me, that's a really nice detail on a base car that you just simply don't expect to find. Now we close the boot on the Sorento, we have a nice separate handle, and it's actually a little bit easier to close than the Toyota Kluger. Let's leave the practicalities behind and start talking about how these cars drive and what they're like to live with. So let's have a quick chat about what's under the bonnet of each of these SUVs, because it's quite similar at the base model, but moving away from the base models, it gets quite different. So starting with the Kluger, you've got a 3.5 litre V6. Here in this guise, it makes 218 kilowatts of power and 350 Newton meters of torque, and sends that to the front wheels via an 8-speed ACEN torque converter automatic. It's a pretty decent engine, but it does feel a little bit old school. Both of these cars feel a little bit old school with a naturally aspirated V6 actually, and you can get a much better option in the hybrid. So that costs an extra $6,500 on top of this, and it's something well worth considering. You can watch Ponch's full review of the base model hybrid, which we reckon might be the best in the range up here in the corner. But yeah, it's not a bad engine, but it's probably not my pick. You can get it with all-wheel drive for $4,000 extra, which neatly brings me on to the Sorento, which is only available in front-wheel drive with the V6. It's also a 3.5 litre V6, so 200 kilowatts of power and 332 Newton meters of torque. But you can get this car with a 2.2 litre diesel, all-wheel drive and an 8-speed automatic transmission for only $3,000 more than this V6, and really that's going to be my pick, because even though it is a diesel and it's a little bit off-trend at the moment, it really suits the character of the Sorento better and gives you better off-road capability as well. You can let me know down in the comment section below what you do though. And before we jump into the running cost segment, just wanted to point this out, neat little detail. The Sorento from base model up has gas bonnet struts. The Kluger, you have to pull that little stick out and stick it into a piece of metal, which is much less cool. This is awesome. Gas struts for the win. All right, let's talk about some running costs. All right, let's talk about the cost of ownership of these two rather large SUVs, starting with the Toyota Kluger. Now in V6 form, it is quite a lot thirstier than the hybrid that Ponch tested a couple of weeks ago. So you're going to be seeing fuel consumption figures closer to 8 litres per 100 Ks on the highway, and then in town you're going to see that blow out to 11 or 12 litres per 100 Ks. It's a pretty thirsty vehicle in suburban and urban settings, so another reason to consider the hybrid. But where the Kluger really kills it is when it comes to affordable servicing. This car needs servicing every 12 months or 15,000 Ks, which is pretty standard, but each service only costs you $250. That means a 5-year or 75,000 kilometre total ownership of this car in servicing is going to cost $1,250, which is not only cheap for the class, but it's also cheap across all classes, and that's something that Toyota really has going for it here in Australia, their affordable servicing. And the warranty is pretty much the same as the servicing, lasting for 5 years and unlimited kilometres, though if you keep up to date with the services and the service intervals, you get an extra 2 years on the engine and drivetrain, bringing that to 7 years, which is equal to the Kia Sorento. Speaking of the Sorento, its 3.5 litre V6 is a multi-point injected unit rather than Toyota's D4S system, and that means it's a little bit thirstier. So where you see about 8.7 litres per 100 Ks claimed in the Kluger, you're going to see 9.7 litres per 100 Ks, says Kia, in the Sorento. Now again, on the highway, it's a little bit lower than that, closer to sort of 8.8 litres per 100 kilometres, but in town it blows right out to sort of 13, 14 litres per 100 Ks, so it is a little bit thirstier. It's also slightly more expensive to service, though the intervals are identical at 12 months or 15,000 kilometres. Now when it comes to 5 years of servicing or 75,000 Ks, this Kia is almost twice as expensive as the Toyota Kluger, which is quite significant. So it costs $2,388 for its 5 scheduled services, though the cap price servicing does run for an extra 2 years to get you to 7 years, which is incidentally how long the warranty on this Kia is as standard. So you get a little bit more peace of mind, but it is a more expensive car to service and fuel than the Kluger. Now, let's take these two SUVs out on the road and see which one's better to drive. All right, first cab off the rank in today's comparison is the Toyota Kluger. Now, you've heard it before on Chasing Cars in Tom's and Ponch's reviews of this car in hybrid and V6 form, that this is a lot better than the car it replaces. There's no competition, that I would be rather driving this Kluger than the old Kluger. There's nothing about the old car that was really better. It didn't ride particularly well, and it didn't handle that great either. The balance wasn't quite there. This new car, which adopts the Toyota New Global Architecture K platform, is a wholly more polished piece of kit. That said, there are still very similar engine choices as there were before, which is to say a 3.5 litre naturally aspirated V6, which we're testing today, which I think feels a little bit dated in today's world. It just makes a lot of noise, and although it's grunty, and I think gruntier than the Sorento, definitely got a bit more mid-range, and the torque comes on earlier. So 4,400 RPM, you get your 350 Newton meters versus 5,000 RPM. You also get a bit more power, 218 kilowatts in this versus 200 kilowatts in the Sorento. So it feels a little bit faster because they're both about the same weight. This car is 1885 curb weight, and it does feel that. Though the refinement isn't quite there with this powertrain package, is what I'm getting at. The engine makes quite a lot of noise, it's quite thrashy, and it also is quite shunty at low speeds. There's this sort of clunkiness when you're just putting small inputs of throttle in when you're rolling around town, and that sort of noise just kind of erodes some of that feeling of serenity that the Kluger otherwise does a very good job of putting across. The other thing is the 8-speed auto, that it's an ACIN unit, and it's left hunting for gears a little bit, which it doesn't need to because there's a fair amount of torque. This is weird for me to say this, but I much prefer the CVT hooked up to the hybrid engine. It just feels like a more Toyota package, and it feels crisper, smoother, and you can just glide along with that sultry electric torque in that vehicle, and I think it suits the character of the Kluger better. But anyway, we're testing the V6. The hybrid's a $6,500 option that I would totally go for, and if that was in this comparison, it would beat the Sorento. But with the V6, you know, it's a little bit more on par. Now let's talk about the comfort you get. This car's got some Toyo open country tyres, which are very soft, which really aid this car in terms of low speed comfort. They really don't transmit any harsh edges, even though they're 18 inches in size. They've still got plenty of sidewall, and the suspension is definitely tuned with a focus on comfort. It's soft, this thing. It's properly plush. And in some ways, that's luxurious. And depending on your outlook on life and what kind of cars you like, you might find that really endearing. But for me, it just feels a little lollopy. The reactions to the steering are just much better than the old car, again, but not quite as crisp as I want. That just feels like if you had to perform an emergency swerve maneuver or something like that, you might end up with a little bit of a tank slapper going on, because it does roll into oversteer. But for most people, and most of the time, the Kluger is a really comfortable and quite serene vehicle to drive, especially in urban settings where it does just glide over bumps, even though the handling isn't quite as good. Now, refinement-wise, it's a little bit louder in here in the cabin. You can hear a bit more of that V6. You can hear a little bit more of what's going on outside. It's like they don't have quite as much insulation. A little bit more road noise comes through than the Sorento, but it's only really back to back that you notice that sort of stuff. I haven't measured on an accurate decibel meter the differences, but I'm sure this would be just a little bit louder at cruising speeds. But again, much of a muchness. Now let's talk about maneuverability as well, because this car is physically larger than the Sorento, both longer and wider and slightly taller as well. More than anything, you notice the width. So it's 30mm wider than the Sorento, 1930mm, and that's what you notice when you've got a threaded around city urban streets. If you live in suburbia where there's a lot of space around you, probably not going to be a big deal, but it does fill up a lot of a space at the local car park. It is a wide vehicle, and you just need to take that into account when you're maneuvering it. Luckily, there's a fine reversing camera. Only on the Highlander do you get a 360-degree cam, which would again aid its maneuvering, but you do get front and rear parking sensors as standard on both of these vehicles. And there's plenty of safety stuff to keep you safe. Both cars on test today score 5 stars in the Australian safety test run by ANCAP, and both of them have plenty of active safety gear. Adaptive cruise control and lane keep assist are much better on this Kluger than I've experienced in a Toyota before, but I think they're still lagging a little bit behind Kia's polish. Hyundai, Kia really nail that. They get that just right, I think. This sort of brakes too early and whatever, but both of them have front and rear AEB, rear cross traffic alert, blind spot monitoring, all the stuff you need in contemporary driving to make sure you're safe, and all the stuff that just takes a little bit of that edge off the task that is driving and makes your day a little bit more relaxing, which is something that the Kluger does. As long as you don't drive it fast, and as long as you don't rev that engine too much, it is certainly a relaxing, cosseting car to drive out on the open road. Now let's jump in quickly to the Kia Sorento to see how that compares back to back with the all-new Toyota Kluger. All right, following up the Toyota Kluger with driving in the Kia Sorento, one of the babies of the big SUV market. It's been such a darling recently. We've really enjoyed our time spent across all of the Kia Sorentos we've been in, because it just feels really well polished. And like the exterior, it seems like Kia's engineers have spent that little bit more time refining some of the characteristics, including the ride quality and the sound insulation in this vehicle. But we'll come back to all of that in a minute, because first we've got to talk about how this engineers out on the road rather than just in theory under the bonnet. Now, this 3.5 litre V6 kicks out 200 kilowatts and 332 Newton meters, but it's not the gruntiest thing when it's pushing around this car, which weighs, its curb weight's around 1850, 1860 kilos, so it's pretty heavy given it's only front wheel drive as well. This is only available in front wheel drive with the V6 as well, which does make it feel a little bit unrefined. You can get the front wheels scrabbling for traction a little bit, though to be fair, not as much as in the Kluger, which has a lot of weight transfer when you get on the throttle, so it really accentuates that feeling of front wheel drive spinning up. This car also has much more high quality tyres. They're Continental Eco Contact 6, so not the premium contacts that you get on the range topping GT line, but they're still a really good tyre, predictable, pretty decently grippy in the wet, certainly a little bit more refined than in the Kluger. Following on from the Eco Contact tyres, we come to the comfort, the ride comfort offered by the Sorento, and for my tastes, I think the Sorento strikes that slightly better balance between ride comfort and control than the Kluger. It's just a little bit more firm in its rebound, and that just keeps the body from rolling around and lolloping around so much when you hit bigger bumps. And while you might think that that means it's a less comfortable car because it's less absorbent or less soft, in actual fact, what it means is that the car is more settled more of the time, and it transmits less of that road undulation into the cabin, which I think is good in the long term for sort of stuff like car sickness and just general comfort in the car. That said, it doesn't have the outright comfort of the Kluger over speed humps and that sort of thing. So your mileage may vary, but I certainly prefer the way that the Sorento rides. It's just more controlled, a little bit more consistent, and I really like this car. I think they've done a great job in tuning the suspension. It's one of the best on the market in this segment. I think maybe even the best, especially in the lower grades. And these 17-inch tires suck up all of those big sharp-edged bumps. So it works really nicely. I think it's a very relaxing car to drive, and feeding back into that is the better refinement in this car. There's less road noise that make its way into the cabin, and there's less little rattles that you hear up on the road. We're on a very smooth road at the moment, which is unlike Sydney, but here it's dead quiet. The only issue I found is that about 100 k's an hour you can hear some wind noise from outside the car, which can be a little intrusive, but really it's pretty minor, and the Kluger has a little bit of that as well anyway. Now let's talk about how this car handles, because where the Sorento actually really excels in my book is just being that little bit better to drive on the road. It's got a nicer steering feel, feels a little bit sharper, and responds more naturally to the driver's inputs. There's less roll and squidge that you get in the Kluger. This feels almost sporty, dare I say it. It's very good. Kia's done a great job, as I said before, balancing that ride comfort and the performance. It's good. I know it doesn't seem like it makes a huge difference for a large SUV, but realistically, when you're performing an emergency swerve and avoid maneuver, which you may have to do in a car like this, the Sorento just feels like it's going to be a better companion for that. It's going to not do any weird wayward roll oversteer, which the Kluger actually has a little bit of a tendency to do. So now when it comes to maneuvering these cars around town as well, I think the Sorento just has the edge. It's a little bit narrower, so 30 millimeters narrower overall, which does make a difference. It just makes it easier to thread through city streets, and also the visibility is better. You've got a bigger opening between the mirror and the touchscreen in this car, and you've also got better rear three-quarter visibility. So I think it's going to be better, and you're going to notice kids around a little bit more easily without having to rely on the safety systems. That said, the safety systems in the Sorento are fantastic and pretty much on par with the Kluger, except that this car does get a center airbag as standard. Both are rated as 5 stars by ANCAP, but that center airbag is a little bit of an extra nicety to have, although the rear curtain airbags don't extend all the way back to the third row like they do in a Hyundai Palisade, so worth considering if you're going to be really regularly carrying more than 5 people in the car. As for driver aids and that sort of stuff, really good package, and Kia really kills it when it comes to this. The lane keeping assist programming and the adaptive cruise control programming are just better than Toyota's. The Kluger's come a long way from other cars and previous generations, but the Kia still has the suite a little bit more nailed down. It follows cars more closely on the freeway and more smoothly slows down to the speed in front, and the lane keeping assist system and the lane trace assist system both work really well to make this car an effortless thing to drive on the freeway. So in summation then, driving the Sorento, just like looking at it from the outside and the inside, it just feels like it's had a little bit more care and attention to detail put in by the engineers and design team in this car's development, which has really paid off in a holistic and polished package. So for me, I think the Kluger, although it's great and does offer that hybrid powertrain, for me it's going to be the Sorento that drives just that little bit better. So we come to the end of this comparison and the need to adjudicate a verdict. But before we get to that, what we've learned today is the base model realness absolutely is real. Both of these 7-seat SUVs in their absolute stripper form offer plenty of technology, comfort, and the necessary safety features to keep your family safe. So really, it is worth checking out these base models if you're shopping higher up the range. But onto the Toyota Kluger GX, and while it is a fantastic car and a really great improvement over the old model, the Kia Sorento just simply edges it out in a couple of factors. It drives slightly nicer, it has crisper responses, it looks better, and it just feels like a more premium product. Now that might not be exactly to your taste, but I know for me, I like the idea of walking out onto my driveway and seeing the Kia Sorento, which has got a bit of verve about it on the outside and on the inside, and just drives that little bit better. Of course, apples and apples here, both of the V6s. I think the Kluger's engine is slightly more powerful and grunty, and you can also get it with a hybrid powertrain right now, which is obviously going to be a big selling point for that car. But the Kia Sorento is either already or very shortly will be available with a plug-in hybrid variant here in Australia, which I think will really lend it a little bit of help in the sales charts. But of course, you can let me know in the comment section down below which of these two cars you prefer and whether you think my verdict's right or wrong. And while you're down there, we'd also love it if you could leave a comment and hit subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.